Looking back at Lawrence Ingrassia's life, you'd think his family was cursed. At the very least, his household had soaked up all the town's bad luck, weaving together a life story that ends with Ingrassia becoming the last living member of his immediate family. In 1968, Ingrassia and his 3 siblings lost their mom to breast cancer.
It was the first cancer in the family. So there was actually no reason for us to suspect anything other than bad luck. It was unfortunate. It was sad, but people die of cancer. In fact, I think in 1968, it was like 300,000 or 400,000 people in the United States died of cancer. So she was one of them.
They chalked it up to more bad luck when over a decade later, his younger sister Angela was diagnosed with abdominal cancer.
She's 23 years old, her whole life ahead of her. So yeah, it was really difficult and painful.
Angela died at age 24.
At that point, it seemed like, this is kind of odd. But still, there wasn't a lot known about hereditary cancers. In fact, little known about genetic causes of cancer. And the other thing is that we actually did have, in our minds, an explanation about what might be causing these cancers. Our father was a research chemist. So we, at some point, started to suspect that perhaps he had inadvertently brought home chemicals, carcinogenic chemicals on his clothes that we ingested and that years later would result in cancer, malignancies.
This was their best guess because, as Ingrassia outlines in his new book, A Fatal Inheritance, scientists didn't have a good understanding of what causes cancer in the 50s and 60s. In fact, it was widely believed during this time that most cancers were due to an unknown virus. While some types of cancer, like cervical cancer, are caused by a viral infection, we now know that there are so many factors that could trigger an illness. By the time researchers accepted that there could be a genetic component, they were still assuming that family members would inherit the same type. So when Ingrassia's nephew, Charlie, developed cancer at 2 years old, around the same time as Angela's diagnosis, doctors still weren't putting the pieces together.
If you go back to the 70s, even then they weren't sure, and even in the early 80s, it was, maybe if it is a cancer that is a specific site. So if you have a lot of breast cancers in a family, maybe that is a signal of something. We don't know what, but maybe that is a signal of something that we have to search for that might be hereditary. Or if there's a lot of colon cancer in a family. But in my family, there was breast cancer, my mother. My sister had abdominal cancer. My nephew, when he was 2 years old, had a soft tissue cancer in his cheek, totally different kind of cancer.
Which led doctors to assume that there was no connection between the diagnoses. However, a similar situation had occurred in a different family that piqued 2 researchers' interest. Doctors Li-Fraumeni and Frederick Lee came across a 23-year-old father with leukemia and his 10-month-old son who had been diagnosed with a soft tissue cancer.
Now, either of these occurrences would be, there's a very low rate of those cancers. The combination of them together in one family sparked their interest and began their research into this family. And as they studied this family, which they called Family A in their research, they found a long, long history of different kinds of cancers. At all ages, many, like my nephew, 2, 3, 4 years old, but also, in the 20s, 30s, whatever.
It would take the duo 2 decades and countless hours of research to identify the cause of all these different cancers in one family line. The gene P53. It's a tumor suppressor protein that, when functioning normally, prevents cancer in our bodies.
Our cells are constantly dividing, and there's a chance that some of those divisions, most of it's benign, but there's a chance that some of those cell divisions will result in cancer that will become malignant. But thanks to millennia of evolution, we actually have certain genes that stop those potentially cancerous genes from becoming malignant and killing us, because that's how we survive. So this cancer suppressor gene, turns out, is really, really important. It's kind of a search and destroy. It detects potentially malignant cells and either repairs them or kills them.
But if you have a mutation of that gene, it stops going after the cancer. In some cases, it can even help the tumors develop. This rare condition is called Li-Fraumeni syndrome.
If you're born with that mutation, that inherited mutation, by age 40, there's a 50% chance you'll have had cancer. The overall population is 5%. If you think about it, it's 10 times higher. In your lifetime, there's a 95% chance that you'll have cancer if you're born with this mutation.
However, it took a while for this research to become mainstream. So Ingrassia's family had no idea their curse was actually an issue with their DNA. But even without this knowledge, the siblings had become hyper-aware of their health.
My second sister, Gina, who died in 1987 of lung cancer, actually started suspecting something, kind of 8 or 9 months before she died. But it took a couple months before they actually detected the lung cancer. She was very healthy, otherwise running marathons or long road races. And so it took a long time for them to discover that. So I think that, again, kind of there wasn't in our mind that, kind of, hey, there's something that we do other than being hyper aware. My brother in particular was, kind of very conscientious. He really, kind of anything kind of that felt off in his body, he would get checked.
In fact, Ingrassia's brother discovered his first cancer by accident while getting an X-ray for a lump under his arm. While that particular concern was benign, the image gave them a view of his lung where they spotted a growing tumor.
He actually had, kind of a number of other cancers, including, kind of prostate cancer, kind of some skin cancer, but he always caught everything early. So I think that was the one thing that we did before we actually knew what was going on.
This vigilance led his brother's oncologist to suggest a genetic test in 2014, just to see if anything peculiar came up.
And then he called me about a month later, and he said, I've tested positive. And he said, what, as much as anything, it's a relief. Now we know, kind of for all this stuff that we surmised and everything, and, kind of weren't sure, is it bad luck, kind of with some chemicals our father brought home. Now we know.
While it didn't help with the grief, Ingrassia says the knowledge brought him a small sense of closure. It was a while before Ingrassia decided to get the test done himself. Though he'd never had cancer, his daughter pushed for him to finally know his status for sure.
So with this particular mutation, there's a 50-50 chance that you will inherit it. And I won the lottery. I did not inherit it. My brother did. His son with cancer did. We can presume my sisters and mother did, although they weren't tested.
It took so long for Ingrassia's family to be flagged because prior to their mother, there was no family history of cancer, which suggests that this gene mutation that's passed down from generation to generation just spontaneously appeared.
In about 5% of cases, the mutation is what we call de novo. It means that when you are conceived, you are born with the mutation. It's a little bit like being born with blue eyes or brown eyes or kind of whatever. It's just on conception. And then you can pass it on. So you didn't really inherit it, but you were born with it. So it is part of your genetic makeup, which then can be passed on. And so that was the other explanation. Another kind of going back to another reason why doctors wouldn't immediately have treating us, wouldn't have suspected, hey, there is something going on because you don't have its long history.
But even knowing his family carried this mutation couldn't save their lives. Early detection can be the difference between life and death, but for some cases, the cancer is too strong for the body to fight off. Charlie beat his first cancer at just 2 years old, then survived a colorectal cancer diagnosis in his late 20s. But several years later, he found a tumor on his hip around the same time his dad, Ingrassia's brother, was being treated for pancreatic cancer.
In a desperate attempt to save his life, and this was one of the hardest things, they had to amputate his leg, including his hip. And he survived for another year, but even then it started spreading throughout his body. And so he died in February of 2019. And my brother, who had been being treated for pancreatic cancer, had been detected early because he was going through this screening and had survived that. And he died 7 months later, in September of 2019. My nephew died in February of 2019 and my brother died in September 2019.
Ingrassia says that while his book is a story of scientific discovery, it's also a love letter to his family. It's a way to preserve the memories and sacrifices for his future generations to remember. This story has brought countless families to Ingrassia's doorstep, thanking him for bringing awareness to a condition that often feels isolating and invisible. And though sharing this knowledge won't provide a cure for people with the P53 mutation, it does help them share the mental and physical burden.
The chances of getting cancer are so high, but I think if you have this cancer, you're constantly waiting for the next one. It's not a matter of if, but when and where the cancer will occur. These families that have it, they know that, if they or their child survived the first cancer, kind of most likely there's going to be another cancer.
Not only do these people have to personally carry this burden, but they have to factor their genetics into the decision to have children. And though there's no treatment specifically for Li-Fraumeni syndrome at the moment, the progress we're seeing with genome editing provides this community with the hope that future generations will be able to end this gene mutation in their lineage. Ingrassia's book, A Fatal Inheritance, is available now wherever books are sold. For more behind the scenes, follow Radio Health Journal on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.